Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the September edition of MergePHP. Um, I'll be your host today for the first part of this, and representing a whole bunch of user groups and meetups across the U.S. and Canada, which we'll talk through now. Once I get out of the way of the slides. Let's see here. Go to that. Nope. Nope. We'll just do this. There we go. All right. So, with all that, um, yeah, we'll go through various user groups that comprise MergePHP, and then we'll intro uh, the talk on Hasura and how to throw a GraphQL API on top of your existing application. So, once I look over here. So, our first meetup here. Let me throw myself off of the screen so y'all won't have to look at me. Is AtlantaPHP. Founded in 2004 with 225 plus events and a whole bunch of members. Their site is AtlantaPHP.org. If that is your local user group, you can see them on Meetup and on Twitter. If you don't already have a license for JetBrains products, whether that is PHP Storm, WebStorm, their Go IDE, or Data Grip, or the list goes on, then email Chris at AtlantaPHP.org, and the first person to send in that email will get a license. We'll call it a raffle for the purposes of this discussion. Next up, we have BostonPHP. He's been around for over 20 years now. A bunch of events, a bunch of members. Each of these, if this is your local meetup group in person, then go ahead and join that meetup so you can get announcements on not only things like Merge, but in-person events that are local to your area. Bobby Cahill is one of the main folks over there, as well as Gene Babin with the Virtual Self-Study Group. Now, there is a front-end boot camp going on. You can, I believe, see more about that on the Boston PHP meetup site. And there are 17 folks from Boston PHP and other similar meetups attending that. So definitely check that out. Next up, there is the meetup that I assist with, AustinPHP, and Logan is here as well as one of the organizers. It's been around, November will be 21 years. Some of us help put on Longhorn PHP Conference, which is coming up this November as well. We have the Texas PHP Slack and Discord groups. Those are linked from AustinPHPchat.com, and a few things on GitHub as well. CPHP in Seattle has been around roughly 20 years. Tim Bond is the organizer for that one. And just up the road in Vancouver, been around 10 years. We have James Doyle and Sean Macy's from PHP Vancouver. Going down to Nevada, you've got the Vegas Programmers Group, or PHP Vegas. That's led by Josh Copeland, with events sponsored by Josh's company, Remote Dev Force. I believe they do have some in-person events going on occasionally, so if you're in the Vegas area, check them out and see what events they have in addition to MergePHP. And in Kansas City, we have Eric, Dan, and John running City PHP user group. And in addition to Merge, they have a local coffee shop meetup there in the Kansas City area. Now we go over to Utah with the UtahPHP user group with Mark Niebergall and Garrett Caswell. You're starting to see a trend here of a whole bunch of meetups starting in the 2002 to 2003, 2004 era. If Utah, Salt Lake City, and nearby is your local area, definitely check out your local meetup there. If you're in San Diego, check out SeattlePHP. The organizers of that one are also the organizers of PHP Tech Conference with PHP Architect. That's John and Eric. And if you're in the Portland area, check out PHPDX. They've been around since 2013 with Elena Holligan as the point person there. They did Cascadia PHP in 2018 and 2019, and hopefully that comes back because it was a great conference. So with the user groups out of the way, as a reminder, PHP release cycles are 2 years of active updates from release, 1 year of security fixes, and then that version is EOL unless supported by your distribution. So that means that 7.4 is long gone. 8.0 will be out of security support in a few months. So if you are pulling your packages directly from PHP source or something that builds directly on top of it, you're going to want to be on 8.1 or 8.2, with 8.3 being released later on this year. So in terms of conferences, we've got Symfony API Platform Conference over in Europe in just about a week, Cake Fest at the end of the month in LA, Symfony Live in early October in Berlin, DPC online in middle of October in kind of European time zones, IPC in Munich, as well as live streamed in late October, Longhorn PHP in Austin, November 2nd through 4th. That's Thursday is the tutorial day. The conference days are Friday, Saturday. Tickets at longhornphp.com. Early bird is available through the end of this month. PHPCon Poland is mid-November. Laracon in Australia is also mid-November. SymphonyCon is in Brussels, Belgium this year in early December. And then getting into 2024, you have PHP UK, February 15th and 16th in London. And then PHP Tech, April 23rd to the 25th in Chicago. So we're starting to see more in-person events showing up for PHP conferences, as well as a mix of events that are still online only. It's good to see these events pop up on the calendar, and whether that's specific to a framework like Laracon was back in July, or something that's specific to the language in general. So with that, this bootcamp thing that I was hinting at earlier, we actually have a slide for it. This is more kind of front-end focused, and you can hop all over to the BostonPHP meetup.com site to find out more information on this. So MergePHP is on various socials, whether that is YouTube, where you are streaming this right now, or viewing a recording, or Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, as well as Mastodon on PHPC Social. In addition, we do have a LinkedIn. If enough of you follow us there, then we should be able to start streaming from there as well. And quick note before we get into the talk for tonight. Next month, as usual, second Thursday of the month, 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. We will be talking about architecture design patterns for PHP with none other than the Utah PHP organizers, Mark Niebergall. Oh, and by the way, if you have a talk idea, we'd like to hear it. Hop over to mphp.io/speakers and fill out the form there. Or you can message us or at us on our usual social media platforms, and we'll see that and try and get back with you. With that, I am happy to turn this over to Anirudh Sanjeev, former coworker of mine, talking about using Hasura to add GraphQL API to existing applications. With that, I'll turn it over to Ani. Here, as I do things.
Hi everyone. My name is Anirudh. You can call me Ani. This is a talk about using Hasura to add a GraphQL API to existing applications. So let's get started. So first of all, I live in Canada where I work as a full stack engineer. You can find my information, and I will have a copy of the slides and all the code and information available on my GitHub soon. So let's get into it. So a couple of disclosures before we get started. So Hasura is actually supported by a for-profit company, and they offer an open source and an enterprise version, and they offer cloud-based solutions and stuff like that. But we will be focusing primarily on the open source aspects. And in the interest of disclosing, there are no conflicts of interest, or I don't get any affiliation or monetary benefit. I'm just a fan of the product. So I thought I'd make a talk about it. So what we'll be going over, first we'll just go have a brief introduction to GraphQL, and I'm gonna have a brief introduction to Hasura. We're gonna have a few example GraphQL queries. Then we're gonna talk about integrating Hasura into a simple Laravel app. We're gonna set up authentication and authorization to ensure that data is secure, and we're gonna talk a little bit about deploying and managing Hasura in production. So yeah, let's get started. So let's just talk about GraphQL. I know that a lot of people might be familiar with it, so we're just going to go over it quickly. So GraphQL is a query language. It's not a particular technology. It's not a software that we can use. It's more of a standard and a query language. Now there are various server implementations, various client implementations. You can build your own server implementations, and a lot of companies have. It was originally developed as an alternative to REST. And some of the big benefits that it has is, one is it reduces overfetching and underfetching, so you fetch exactly the amount of data that you require, and you can define the structure of responses. So this means that you get the data in the format, especially if you're building a client, a front-end client like a mobile app or a web app or something. A GraphQL query looks like this. So essentially it looks like JSON, but it's not JSON exactly. You have a structure where you define how your data you want to look. You can pass arguments to each parts of the query, and the response basically is JSON. And the response usually follows exactly the format that the nodes on the query is. Behind the scenes, most GraphQL queries are typically just post requests to a single endpoint. Even when you're just fetching data, we use post because we want to send post data in the body of the request. So you would just typically just make a request, and you would have a content type, and you would pass the GraphQL query itself as a string, and you would pass a bunch of variables so that this prevents, this allows you to separate the variables and the query. The A few things that GraphQL can do. One of them is filtering. So as I said, they allow you to filter various nodes, whatever these are called, the nodes, where you can filter various nodes by arguments. So for example, if I want to just find the post where the title contain GraphQL, so essentially it fetches a list of users, at least the user ID number 1. I get the name and the email of the user, and I get all the posts the user has written along with the title and content. the filters are implemented server side and they're declared in a schema. So this is something we're going to talk about, but essentially every single aspect of this has been declared in a schema. You cannot, there are tools to validate a GraphQL query against a schema to ensure that the query is valid. Uh, the GraphQL also supports mutations. So mutations are essentially a way to change the server data. They have well-defined argument and return types, and the server has to implement the logic to perform the mutation. So, for example, in this is an alternative to just making a regular post request, but the big benefit over here that you would get is that there is a static typing, so you would know exactly what types are supported, so you'd be able to catch a lot of these issues during build time with the right tooling. So you would be able to call add user, for example, with a name and email and get the ID and name and email back. So this way you basically make the request and then you can even require only the fields that you need in your response. So one interesting thing about GraphQL, which maybe not all of them support, is something called subscriptions. A subscription is like a query, but you get notified when new data is available. So, for example, if I wanted to have if I have an option to have a subscription called post added, this would essentially open up a WebSocket to the server, and whenever something would get added, this would basically again return the response. It would return a new post information directly through that. There are a few issues with GraphQL. It's not perfect. So one big issue is performance. So essentially, if you're not careful, because the GraphQL allows a lot of nesting and it allows a lot of joins between data, if you're poorly optimized or like poorly written queries, they can get pretty complex and it ends up in degraded server performance. Another thing is that a response can sometimes contain unnecessary data and have additional overhead. Maybe it has additional objects that you do not need, but usually you can remove them. But sometimes there is a lot of overhead in these objects. And the big problem is complexity. Building your own GraphQL API from scratch can be quite complex. There are definitely libraries available, but there is a lot of work involved in making sure that the schemas are properly supported, and you need to use a lot of language specific libraries. So some of the few, just give me a second. Some of the few benefits of GraphQL, one of them is that there is typed. A lot of time nowadays, like static typing is pretty popular with TypeScript and typing in PHP, but GraphQL has a script schema. Like it has a pretty strict schema, so you can write type safe requests. As you'll see, there is plenty of tooling available. There is plenty of software available to validate the requests. You can even have generators, which basically run your look at your schema and generate builders for you, so that you know exactly what the type is going to be. It also allows you to fetch nested and related objects, so this saves you multiple round trips. If you're finding yourself making a REST request for a resource and looping through the resource items and getting the details for them, something like GraphQL is very helpful in those sort of situations. So now let's just talk a little bit about Hasura. So Hasura scans your database and builds a standard GraphQL API for your data. So it is a software that sits, and the second thing is it's language and framework agnostic. It does not matter what backend. We're just talking about it with a PHP application, but it's just as straightforward to implement with Python or Node.js or any other application. Various databases are supported, but it started out supporting Postgres, and historically that is the one that's best supported. One thing to note is that Hasura doesn't actually query your data. It doesn't read your data or query your data, but it generates SQL, which is run by your database. And so essentially, again, the primary thing that impacts your performance is going to be the power of your database and how well the schema and the indexes are set up. The other thing about Hasura is you will need to install it on a server where it'll expose a HTTP API. So this is not something which would be, it's not something that you can install it as a dependency for your application. You will need to install it on a standalone server or a container runtime or something like that. There is also a cloud-based version that we won't touch upon, but there is possibility that we will briefly mention it later on, but it is possible to run it without having to run it yourself. So let's talk about where Hasura fits in your stack. It's primarily meant to be used by your client front end or app. So if you've got like a application with a lot of JavaScript, or you've got like a mobile app and they need to query data from the backend, Hasura can effectively act as a simple CRUD. Maybe not CRUD, but more like just primarily for reading the data. It provides a simple, straightforward way to do it. It's not meant to replace your backend. The one thing that a lot of people think is that it means that you can just get rid of your backend entirely. It's just meant to complement it and take care of the sort of low hanging fruit of REST APIs, in where you're just basically fetching an object, authorizing it, and returning it, and serializing and returning it. It takes care of all of that. So you don't have to implement anything like filtering. You don't have to implement, sorting, filtering, pagination, all of that stuff. Uh, the cool thing is that front end team can build custom GraphQL queries to get exactly the data that they need. So this way that, if tomorrow you find the front end team needs to build a new UI for like some sort of reporting, you don't need to sit down and build a backend application, backend endpoint for it. They can just write a separate query and get the data that they need. You can use it for less complex data fetching. There are certainly limitations of Hasura where beyond a certain point, it's going to be difficult to make it work with your data, but it works for most use cases. It is very crucial to make sure that you still have a regular backend for more advanced features. For example, if you need Stripe integration, you need to query Stripe customer data alongside your database. You won't be able to do that with Hasura since it only looks at your database. So you would want to have a separate backend for that as well. So what Hasura is not is it's not an ORM alternative for your SQL or ORM. So it's not meant to be used by your backend. It's not something that you would use primarily in the PHP side of things, but we will come to about how we can integrate it. And it's not intended to be a backend in a box like Firebase or some other tools. A lot of people try to use it in that way, but it's not great for that sort of situation. So let's go over a quick demo. So what I have over here is I have the Hasura console. I have a sample database. It's called Pagila, if I believe. It's an open source database containing some information about video rental stores. This is the Hasura console. So this is primarily how you would be managing your instance. We're going to be talking a little bit more about it, about how it works in production and stuff like that. But primarily we can say this is how you'd be managing it. So like I said, this is a GraphQL API explorer. Let's make a simple one. Let's say you want to just get a list of films, and I'm going to just say a limit of 10, and I want to get the title of the film and the description, and I can hit play, and now I get all of this over here. So one cool thing is I can start typing and I get autocomplete over here. The reason is that because there is a schema, I can get autocomplete. I get documentation. So essentially, I can get documentation about every aspect of it. I can get the schema right here about what are the items supported. I can even build the queries from a builder over here. Let's make it a bit more complex. So now let's say actors. I want to get the actors as a pivot table. So essentially, it has an actor ID and it has a film ID. So it's a many-to-many relationship. So I can essentially go ahead and pull actor, first name and last name. And now when I go over here, I can say, hey, here's a movie, here's a description, and here are the actors. So this is something that either you would have to do if you were building a backend for this. You would have to sit down and perform a join on them. And it's not just about joining it, but again, providing all the data in a structured manner would have taken a bit more effort. The other option is you would have had to make a get request to get the list of 10 films, and for each of the films you'd have to probably fetch the actors, or essentially you'd have to write a serializer or a resource or something like that. But this basically gives you everything for free. It also allows you to do some amount of aggregation. So for example, if I don't want to see the actors in a film, but I want to see how many actors are there, so I basically just want to get aggregate count. So I want to get over here, I can see there are 10 actors over here. I can see there are 4 actors over here, and something like that. Now, Hasura also works pretty well with some basic reporting. Now, let's say that I want to kind of make a report on which of the films are there with the most number of actors. So I can say film and I can say order by actors aggregate and count descending. Now, if I run this, I basically see, hey, here's a movie called Lamb Cincinnati with 15 actors on it. So I can sort of go ahead and I can build this and I can get all this information. And all of this I got without having to build anything on the back end. This is pretty interesting. So let me pull up, let me see. Oh, yikes. Let's see a couple of other queries that are sort of built up ahead of time. So this query gives you a list of actors by which actor made the most films. So essentially I'm querying actor, I'm pulling the first name and last name, and I'm pulling in the aggregate, essentially distincting it on the film ID. So it's basically, it's like doing a select count star where group by the film ID, and I'm ordering it by descending. It's pretty straightforward. I know it looks like it may look a little complex, but it's pretty straightforward when you take a closer look at it. You're essentially limiting it to 10. You're ordering it by films aggregate and doing this. So you can go ahead and you can see which are the actors which have made the most movies from a, let's do descending. Again, because of the autocomplete, I get that. So a couple of other things while we're at Hasura. So let's say that you don't want to sit down and export GraphQL. So you can actually just go ahead and you can convert this into a REST endpoint. So I can essentially say, hey, here's a query. I'm gonna do this, and I'm gonna guess say most popular actors, and I can go ahead and I can go ahead and I can say here's a GET request, and now I can essentially just make this API call, and oh, yikes. And I'm going, okay, I have to set that up. But yeah, essentially there's a bunch of stuff you can do with it. Another thing is, for example, I want to get the, it works particularly well when you're not doing any fancy stuff. So here's a simple query which basically says here are a few pending return rentals. So I'm going to pull out the rentals, and I'm pulling out the customer, the first name and the last name of the customer, and I'm pulling out the inventory of the customer as well, like what film that they were yet to return. So that's a few of the things that we can do with Hasura. We'll go through a few more things in case we have time later on, but let's sort of go over what you would need to do to install it. To install it, you would basically have to download the Docker Compose file, and you would have to edit the Docker Compose file and modify certain environment variables. You'd basically have to set up an admin secret, and you just have to hit up. So let me just walk you through one of the Docker Compose files. So I've got one over here, and again, over here, I just have a test database and stuff like that. But you can set up the database URL. So it essentially tell Hasura which database you're linking it to. Whether you want to enable a console, which is the web interface, you would normally want to set this to false in production so that the web interface is not available and you manage it through the API. Whether you've got dev mode, logging, and you've got an admin secret. So the admin secret is essentially like a master password, which you can always disable, but there are ways to do authentication, but this basically allows you to manage the instance itself. So this is something that we're going to be going over as well later on. But yeah, so now when we have that, and you would have to set up the tables and relationships. So when you go to a database and you look at the data tab over here, Hasura doesn't track every table by default. So for example, it doesn't track the address, the city, the country, and all the stuff like that. But let's look at the store table over here. So the store table has a manager staff ID. Now, the staff, in case I go to the API over here and I look at the store ID, and yeah, I don't have that, but okay, I have the manager staff ID, but I just have the IDs over here. Now, if I go to data and I want to contain information about the staff, so I can essentially track the staff table, ensure that, okay, these are the columns that I want to expose. So for example, if I don't want to expose the password, I can remove the Oh, okay. I can remove the password. I can unstack it, but also I can set up relationships. So, for example, with the staff table, I have now with the store table, I can say I want this. I want this new relationship. So now when I go back to the API, I can go over here in the store, and now I can say staff first name and last name. So I didn't have this before, but now when I run this, I can pull this because now it has tracking that relationship. So again, I know one of the things is that a lot of people might be feeling that, hey, there's a, like, how do you ensure that someone can access data and someone cannot access data? And that's a common concern, and we will definitely come to that really soon. But this is just to show how it looks at your database and finds all the data. So in production, just to give a brief overview, because there's a bunch of different options, but it is server-side software. You will need to deploy this on a server. You can either use Elastic Container Store, or you can use Docker or Kubernetes. You will need a Postgres database to store the metadata, which is essentially the configuration of the application itself. There is a managed cloud hosted option available. So essentially, you can set that up and you can connect it to your database through a SSH tunnel or some sort, and that would work as well. And if you build it yourself, you would obviously have to configure Nginx, because this does not support any of the SSL or gzip or caching. So you'll have to use a Nginx for front-end proxy. So let's do a bit of hands-on development. Now let's build a simple event management application. A basic version has already been built, but I'm going to still go over it. It's built with Laravel and React. Again, let's not worry too much about the front end or the back end application. The focus is going to be more on the database and GraphQL. So in the current state, the app does have some issues. Let's find the issues and let's fix them. So, okay, the database structure is a little out of date, but essentially you've got a users table and you've got an events table. And you've got a user event pivot table with the event ID and the user ID. Don't worry about the role that has been removed. Sorry about that. So the thing that we need to know is a user can see all the events that they're attending. So essentially, when the access control rules that we're aiming for is that if I go on the site, I should be able to see every event that I'm attending. I shouldn't be able to see someone else's events, and nobody should be able to see mine. An events organizer should be able to see the name and the email of all the attendees. The queries that we'd want to try and do is, one, list all the events that I'm attending and list all the events that I'm organizing along with the attendees. So let's sort of go over the application. Right, so I've got a application over here. Let me just pull that up. So I've just got an application over here, and it says, hey, here are the events that I'm attending. I've got a Python conference and a Haskell conference. And then an event that I'm organizing, one of them is a PHP conference with a bunch of attendees. One is a JavaScript conference, which is a bunch of attendees. So this essentially works like this. So I've got an API console for that as well. So let's look at the queries that we're making. So let's first look at the query get user query. So this just to say hello to someone. So I can go over here and let's get rid of these for now. But so I've got the user ID over here as a parameter, and I'm going to say hit. So this essentially for user ID 1, I get the name and email of that particular user. And I can go ahead, and once I get the details out, I just need to display it in React. I even have the a list of events that I'm attending. So for that, I'm just going to be saying, hey, give me the events where the attendees is basically like a pivot table. The attendees have, so where the attendees have a user ID where it's equal to my user ID. So I have that, I've got the name and I've got the event date. So that pulls it out and it gives the information. Again, I just take that and I turn it into a simple UI. As for the organizing events, where is that? Yeah, here we go. Yeah, for the organizing events, I have this query over here, where I essentially check which are the events where the organizer ID, which basically is like ID on the events table equals my user ID. So essentially, that's the way we have to read it, like where the organizer ID equals the current user ID. I am going to find the name, event date, and the attendees, and on all of them over here. So now this works fine, but there is one big glaring problem that we basically don't have any way of validating whether this user ID is right or not. So I can change it to user ID 2 and I give a completely different set of results. In fact, what I can do is I can go over here, I can go to the user ID. Let's say we get a malicious user ID over here who basically just goes ahead and changes the user ID in the client side. And this is on the JavaScript side. I'm not changing the PHP side. So now what happens is, even though I'm logged in as user 1, I'm basically showing all the details of user 2. So we need a way to fix this. This is a big problem. So for that, okay, we're just going over the same. Yeah, there is nothing to stop someone of changing the user ID and seeing someone else's event. So that is a big issue with GraphQL, because, and especially Hasura, that if you're allowing someone to make any query on your database, how do you ensure that they do not access the information that they should not? The way that you do it is through pretty fine-grained access control. And what you do for this is you basically add top level conditions on each table, which are applied while performing the SQL query. So for example, if you've got before access control, I'm just trying to find all the users where email is john@example.com, and I'm trying to pull out the name and email. This would basically give me all the users that I don't have access to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have Hasura say, hey, whatever query you get, add this query, add this condition over here where ID equals X Hasura user ID. X Hasura user ID is a special parameter we'll get to, but that basically is a validated user ID which cannot be tampered with. So this way, let's say that the user has a user does not have this email, because we're running this AND query over here, we do not get to access the rows that they're looking for. So this way, effectively, we're basically just controlling on every single table, but we need to do this for every single table. We need to write access control rules for every single table. So the way that we do this effectively is, first we need to tell Hasura the user ID of the client requesting the data. So we need to specifically mention, hey, this is the ID of the user, the type of rules it needs to apply. So for example, you may need to apply different set of restriction rules as we'll go over it, but the type of rules or the category of rules we're going to have to talk about, we're going to have to specify that as well. We may need to provide any additional context about the user and session. For example, if you've got a multi-tenant app and you've got like a different organization ID and stuff like that, you can provide that as well. And there's a way to provide all of this in a secure tamper-proof method. The authentication option is to provide this. There are basically two options. Option one is to use a webhook, where your front end calls the GraphQL API with your headers and session cookies. And your backend is basically Hasura. You configure it and you provide a URL, and that calls your backend and provides all the headers. It basically forwards all the headers. Through those headers, you can look up the user ID and other session information, and you can provide it back to Hasura. So this way, there's a secure connection between Hasura and your server. This is a bit more flexible, but this has a performance penalty because it needs to do a round trip every single time it has those. It needs to perform an authentication. The other option is to use a JWT. JSON Web Toolkit is essentially a signed JSON object. So essentially, you create a JSON object and you use a secure cryptographic method to sign it and ensure that it only came from your server. The token is provided to the front end via some means, either through a HTTP request or you're providing it on the page load or some other format. The front end provides this token as a header to the GraphQL API. And Hasura decodes the object and verifies the signature, because you're either providing the signing secret or you're providing the public key, but basically there's a way that it cryptographically verifies that the object was signed on your server. This requires some shared config and modifications to the whole Docker config, but this is generally more efficient, and this is the approach that we're going to take. So, one sec. The backend generates a JSON with something called claims. So we would generate a JSON object. There's a particular schema where you mention the claims that you're going to be have, and with a JW access token, you can mention what the default role of the user is, what are the allowed roles of the user. So for example, if the user has an admin or a super user role, they will you can mention them, or if they're just using a simple role, or you can mention the user ID, the organization ID, and any other custom values, and all of these can be used in queries while applying them to the server. The way you can do this in PHP is to just get an object. There's a package that I looked at called really simple JWT, which worked fine. And you essentially just build up a payload, which is an object, and you take that and you just return a string, and you take that string and you push that through to the front end. The next thing, let's just talk about, like, we'll go over the demo in the code a little bit, but I want to talk a little bit about roles. So let's look at the users table. So the user must be able to read the name, email, and created ad to access their profile. So for example, if you want to see, hey, you've been a user for this many months or something like that, you need access to all of this information. But an organizer needs to read the name of the organizer needs to read just the name of all the attendees of their events. The organizer must not be able to read the name of other users who are not their attendees, but they still need to read the name of the user objects. So we need to add a rule on table, the users table, saying that, hey, if let's say we add a rule like this, the user ID equals X Hasura user ID. This means that any user can now read their own row on the table. So we essentially solved problem one. But the organizer cannot see the rows of any other user because we're going to be applying these rules to them as well. So the solution is roles. Roles allow fine-tuning column visibility, and it allows you to write a separate access control query for each roles. So we create two roles over here. We create a user role, which is more restrictive but exposes more data, and we create an organizer role, which has less restrictive rules but exposes only the name. While making requests, we switch the roles depending upon the part of the UI that we want to display. So we can dynamically, while making a request, we just need to specify a header, and we select which role we're going to be applying. But still, it's still secure. We only ensure we're displaying what we want to display. We're not displaying anything else. We're not providing anything else to the front end. How would we implement the role, the user? So all we need to do is just make sure that if we're making a query on the users table, we would just need to say, hey, find the ID, make sure that it's equal to X Hasura user ID, and we can fetch all the information over there. But this is a little old, but previously when attending was like, so sorry, my bad, this is correct. But so if you're looking at an organizer, so what we're going to say, fetch all the users. Among the users, whoever are in the attending, meaning that they've got a pivot table, you're using the pivot table, you find the event of the pivot table, and you see the organizer ID of that, and see, is it the organizer that's requesting this particular object? It sounds a little counterintuitive and confusing, I know, but we will definitely kind of do a demo, and it might be a bit more clear. The other thing that we can do, okay, so let's sort of go a little bit and kind of look at the access control rules. Let's see how we would set it up. So in our data column over here, so let's look at the users table. Now in the users, I'm going to go to the permissions section. So now you see over here, the admin has access for everything. But we're never giving the admin role to anyone, but they can access, select, insert, they can access any data on the database which is exposed to Hasura. The user table, I have a row select permission, where essentially if the ID equals X Hasura user ID, in that case, it goes ahead and it applies this check. But for the organizer, I have the column selection, the row select permissions, where if the user is attending an event where the organizer ID equals X Hasura user ID. And then you can only allow the organizer to access the name. They cannot make aggregation queries, and they don't have any other like stuff like that. So this way we need to set up permissions for every one of them. So for example, if you've got a user, events, you want to basically, there are no checks because any user can read all the events. So but there are certain permissions like that I won't go over each of them. But essentially every table has, for example, to access the event user pivot table, I want to make sure that I'm allowing accessing of event like it's a little bit on the complex side, but I'm just mentioning that it is possible. But this is something that you're gonna have to play around with a little bit. But let's go through the demos. So what I'm gonna do now is, instead of this, I'm going to uh, expose a token over here along with the user ID. While I'm rendering the dashboard, I'm using inertia in this case, which is basically a Laravel thing where I can render a React component and provide it certain information from the backend. But I am providing the token from the backend. So when I open up this demo over here, I have a little thing over here saying show your token. So if I take my token and, oh, yikes. Okay. Okay. Okay, that's really annoying. Okay, I got it. So I've got GWT decoding. Yeah. So when I paste the token over here, I get a list of all the claims and stuff like that. And I can, in fact, even pull up the secret from .env. So this is the signing secret used to sign the JWT, and I just have to sign it, and it can verify the signature. So essentially, this token is enough to tell for Hasura to verify that I'm the right user. So now when I go ahead and make the query and do it as before, where I go ahead and say user ID, and I reload it, nothing works. I don't know why this still works, but maybe I didn't set that up properly. So, but essentially it still works. In fact, over here, what I can go now and I can see is I can simulate this by basically saying, hey, I'm going to be simulating user ID 1. I've got as a user role, and I'm allowed to take the user and organizer role. So for example, if I'm going to be go ahead and trying to find the name of all the users, well, let's get rid of the. So if I'm going as a user role over here, I only have access to one role over here. So, but I can access the email, created at, and other factors like that. But now when I switch to the organizer role, I can't even do it because the organizer role doesn't have access to these query fields, but I have to get rid of them. But now when I do, I have access to all the users on my table, which only the users that are attending some of my events. So this is something that allows you to write pretty permissive queries, and that allows you to get only the information that you need. There are certain other things as well, but we'll probably see if we can go through authorization a bit more towards the end when we can. One option is that Hasura allows you to perform mutations, which is basically to update the database. So for example, you can update the events, and you can, I can probably just do a demo, but I don't have a. Yeah, so for example, I can just say update the events where the event equals a particular ID and set the new name. And I can just say event name 1. Yeah, I can, and only if I'm an organizer. So for example, if I'm a user, I can't run this. So basically I can't run any mutations. But for example, if I'm an organizer, I can run this particular mutation query over here, and it affected the rows. So in case I go back to the dashboard, it should have updated the organizing events. The reason for this is that even for the mutations, I can specify, like I can go into the data. If I go into events and the permissions for updates, I can specify, I have some basic input validation, like you can hook up an HTTP endpoint to validate it. I can specify which, who can update it. So essentially only if the organizer ID equals the current ID, it allows you to update the events object. and it only allows you to update the name. It doesn't allow you to update any of the other columns. So it allows you some amount of flexibility, but mutations are still one of those things which we'll come to, but it's not something which is the most flexible solution. So one of the few, like as I mentioned, we have a few warnings about mutations. So there's very little validation or guardrails by default. You can hook it up with a HTTP endpoint to validate it, but again, it's always something which you have to be careful of it, because it may put your database in an inconsistent state. But for some simple situations, it may be useful, but most often than not, it's just straightforward to just use a backend. The option that you have if you do want to do mutations is you can just use your backend, make a simple post request. But if you do want to use the statically typed option, Hasura has something called actions, where you can have a type GraphQL mutation. You can specify the type, you can specify the schema and signature, which calls HTTP API. So it's just, HTTP API with an extra steps. So this, useful for things like calling third-party APIs like Stripe. So this is something that is an option as well. So the last thing that we'll kind of come to is about managing Hasura metadata. I'm just checking the time, but yeah, we should have a few minutes to go through this. So the big thing that we need to know is, you just saw me edit everything on a website. And if you've deployed stuff for production, you know that, hey, how do I keep this in sync with what I have on my production? Now, if I'm sitting down and building this through the UI and I'm clicking around with all the buttons, that's fine for kind of building a demo or building a local application. But how do I do this in a production application when multiple people are doing this? And the way to do that is through the metadata. So what it lets you do is essentially get the configuration of the entire configuration of the Hasura instance through YAML files. So it lets you keep the configuration centralized in one place, like a Git repository. So for example, here's one over here where I've got one for the demo. I've got the metadata, I've got the databases, and I've got the users table. So essentially it keeps the relationships, it puts the select permissions, it keeps the authorization rules. Essentially every single aspect that you need to manage Hasura is available over here. And it's possible to use both. It's possible to use both the web interface to kind of quickly prototype stuff, but using this, you can apply the exact same configuration on any Hasura instance. So if you've got a production database, you can have a CI system, which basically runs something which updates the metadata on the server. But one thing you can do is you can run Hasura metadata export. And what that does is it looks through all the web interface and it pulls up all the changes and syncs it with your local. Essentially, it uses it kind of updates your local source code with. Anyway, one option is you can use Hasura metadata diff, which lets you identify changes between the target instance and the metadata encode. So, for example, it tells you what are the changes between the project, essentially the YAML code that you have and the server. So it mentions and says, hey, here are 2 items that I've removed. And it lets you preview the changes so that you make sure that, what are the new changes that are going to go into my YAML or new changes that are going to go into the remote instance. So that is the way to do that. And generally, you can also apply it, and you can apply to override the Hasura's configuration with the one that you have in your code. But sorry, this section is a little it's a little complex. So when you go into actually management, there are a lot of nuances involved over here. But let's say that you clearly basically want to add a new table. For that, these are the steps that you'd be taking. First, you'd add a new table to your test database via migration or some other means. So you'd first add it to your database. Then you'd configure your local Hasura instance, where you would add the new table in Hasura and set the access rules and stuff like that. Then you would test it in compatibility with the front end. So, for example, you'd build your front end UI and stuff like that and make sure that everything works as expected. Then you would export the metadata. So you would run a Hasura metadata export to take the changes and append it to your code config. Once you do that, you basically commit and push the modifications, And once you're done, someone or a CI service will basically execute, Hasura metadata apply on the production server. Sorry that the font is not, the monospace font does not stand out on this theme, but essentially that's the command that you would be running on the production server. So let's sort of just talk about, like, while wrapping up, since we've got just a couple of minutes, let's talk about when it's not a good time to use Hasura. One is when your database structure is pretty large and complex. So essentially it all boils down to is, if you've got a complex application which requires a lot of joins and a lot of handwritten SQL, or really, if you want something to be careful about SQL. So let me kind of just give you a quick overview of something I forgot to mention in the demo. So let's look at a query over here, not a mutation, but yeah, let's see this event over here. So when I run this, I get this information over here. What this actually does is, if you hit analyze, I get a generated SQL over here. Now, all it's doing is it's taking it. It looks like a lot of SQL, but all it's doing is it's taking that, and if I go ahead and go to your SQL runner and run all of this and just run this, all I do is I just get the same JSON back over here. So Hasura basically does nothing to process your data or do any of the other stuff. It just generates this entire SQL. I mean, it's still pretty hard to do it, but this lets it perform all the operations on SQL itself. But what this means is that if your database is pretty complex with the sense of with a lot of joins and stuff like that, you may end up finding that the performance starts struggling, especially when you've got larger databases. So this is something you're going to have to be a little careful with. But if you do have these conditions, for example, if you can working with an app and you've just started recently and you can adapt your schema to work well with it, and your access control rules are relatively simple and to define and audit, and if you use like type languages which can benefit from these sort of like query systems, and your team is willing to integrate a new tool and is willing to explore the option of doing this, because this can be a bit of a learning curve, but it can pay off in the long run. But everyone on the team has to sort of get in on it, and your needs are simple. So essentially, if anything that can be done with ORMs or simple REST endpoints, you can do it with Hasura. So it's not meant for really complex endpoints, but if you've got simple needs, you can probably benefit from this, and this is something that you can probably look at. Yeah, and that's it. Sorry, I probably want to go over some other stuff, but I don't want to get too deep into the rabbit hole. But any questions? I'll probably open the YouTube link over here.
Hey, Annie, thanks for the presentation. Yeah, we got a couple questions. So they were just wondering if it can be used for NoSQL as well as SQL.
So I think it does support MongoDB. Yeah, it does support MongoDB to some extent. There is actually a link. There's a database feature support. I'm just going to bring it up over here. Wait.
You may have to stop sharing. Oh, there,
Okay.
Here, there you go. There you go.
So in the feature support over here, these are some of the ones that it support. So I guess that it has. Okay, we're just mentioning that, but I think it did support MongoDB. Oh, sorry. It does support it on, but I guess it's not available on the open source version. So that's why we don't have it over here. Yeah.
Makes sense. All the good stuff's hidden behind the paywall. Catherine was wondering, is there best practice for recovery after disaster? And would how about like setting up a CI process for like integration? Like how would you go about setting up a CI for Hasura?
So for that, yeah, the thing is over here now. What I've got is so this is something that I was doing right now, because in case I messed up something with the config, I had these backups. So if I go to the demo over here, and metadata. So yeah, I can basically say Hasura diff. Oh. So I can see that there are no changes over here. But let's say that something goes wrong and I kind of go ahead and go to my data, and in my users table, I nuke permissions. I delete the permissions, and now things are broken. So what I can just do is I can just say metadata apply, and that overwrites it and brings it back. So essentially the source of truth is going to be your source code. And what you can do is you can, for example, if I want to say, hey, you know what, I don't want to have the remember token and the email verified at saved. So I can save the permission. I can just say, and now let me go through the code over here. And now in the table over here, I still have email verified at and remember token. So what I can do is diff, and that says, hey, these are the entries removed and added, and I can just say export. And what that's going to do is update the code over here. So now I can just say get diff, and that goes ahead and shows me what have been changed. So I can basically use that to manage it.
Awesome. So it goes both ways there. Great. Let's see. I was watching you do stuff, so I'm behind in questions. Is there does it track the query history and execution time like a slow log on MySQL?
I don't think so. So essentially, since it performs the queries on SQL itself, I guess it should have a log, because like it does have a lot of stuff again behind the enterprise. So it has query, it has Prometheus metrics and a bunch of stuff for like, again, but all of the good stuff is hidden behind the enterprise version. So it does have Prometheus, and it has like response caching and a bunch of other stuff. So, but those aren't available in the open source version.
Great. Well, I had a question here. I'll stall for time for a little bit. Maybe we have a couple more questions for Ani. Make sure to drop them in the YouTube comments. So my question is, if you're unfamiliar with, you've been using, MySQL or NoSQL, but you don't know GraphQL and kind of that whole syntax. Is there some recommendations on good resources, learning-wise, YouTube videos or Udemy, or, like kind of getting a handle on like the syntax and just how it works, I guess?
Right. So there are two parts to this. One is if you want to learn the GraphQL. So GraphQL is more of a standard. So it's very loosely structured standard where, it's not particular about your database. So, but for Hasura itself, they've got a standard, like a very, for example, the stuff of attendees aggregate. Having an aggregate, something like this is not a GraphQL standard. It's something that Hasura does. And the best solution is just to play around with stuff and see what happens, because there are definitely plenty of tutorials. The language itself you can pick up in an afternoon, but the nuances of performance and what you can query, what you can't, and what you shouldn't, that's something that just takes a few weeks of trial and error.
Okay. Sounds good. Let's see. I'm not seeing any more questions. Does it work with WebSockets? Sorry.
It does. So,
Yeah.
for example, if I say, hey, I want to add a new subscription, and I go to users, and I'm going to go to users and name. I'm going to remove all of these things and do this. Actually, I haven't tried this, but okay, I'm putting it in guard mode, where basically it's like it has access to all the database. But I can say that, and I've got all these users over here, and hopefully if I register, okay, I don't know why it didn't come up. Okay, probably it's, I thought I had a subscription. Okay. Yeah, but it does work with subscriptions. This is something I have tried it out. Sorry, I can't reproduce it
Cool.
right now, but it does work with WebSockets.
Awesome. It's interesting. Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you so much for the talk. Let me just double check the questions here. Lots of good feedback here. Thank you for the talk. So, yeah, we're happy to have you speak, and if you have some more talks in the future, definitely let us know.
Thank you so much. Yeah,
we'd
it
love
was
to
a
have
lot
you
of fun.
back.
I learned a lot while preparing for this, so I had a lot of
There's
fun.
a ton of work that goes into these things, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
it was a lot of fun. I haven't given a talk in a long while, and this is my first like really professional talk which I've given. So hopefully I can continue talking on these things. But it was a great way
Awesome.
of getting my feet wet. So yeah.
Yep.
All right,
That's the
thank you
way
so
to
much
do
for
it.
having me.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, stick around here, and I'm gonna go ahead and end the public stream, but I think we can talk a bit
Sure.
afterwards. So thank you everyone for joining MergePHP. I can't believe it's September. Definitely check out our website. We've got a website now, mergephp.com, and we'll get next month posted here shortly. So hope to see you all again in October. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone.